akan bagi ilmunya tentang ekspertisnya di bidang sastra kolonial dan post-kolonial Belanda. Of course, this event would be in English. We really hope it will be in Dutch, but of course, there will be so much language barrier. So I would like to once again welcome. So this event is entitled "A Girdle of Emerald." This is a very famous expression to portray Indonesia in the colonial period, Dutch colonial and post-colonial literature from Max Havelaar, 1860, to the Interpreter of Java to 2016. So this allow me to inform you that this event organized by the Department of History and the Department of Language and Literature, Faculty of Cultural Sciences of Universitas Padang. My name is Odi, and I will be your moderator today. So before we start, I would like to inform you as well that it's a very delighted for us to begin our week with a lecture or with a discussion. It has been a while that we haven't done this offline meeting, of course. You are among the first guests, international guests that we received hopefully in the end of the pandemics. I don't want to say post-pandemics, but it's no longer end. This is the first event of this week. In this whole week, the Department of History will have 5 consecutive days of events. And this is the first, di hari pertama dari acara yang akan diselenggarakan oleh Departemen Sejarah. Besok di ruang yang sama, jam yang sama, there will be a public lecture by Professor Susan Lejeune about the heritage relief, and of course there will be a discussion about repatriation, shared heritage, museums. And Wednesday and Thursday there will be a conference that also take place in this room, and on Friday we will have master class. It's a week full of events, and because of the friendliness between the UGM and VU. Before I introduce you to Dr. Jacqueline Bell, I would like to open this session with this lecture for something that I remember. So maybe every one of you are aware that last year last year was till 2021. I speak about 2020. There was the Black Lives Matter movement that took place all around the world. And of course, scholars reacted in such a way they begin to rediscuss about colonialisms, and what is unsolved from colonialism. So we really expect that scholars will react in such a way. But what I would like to tell you is how a bookstore reacted to the Black Lives Matter movement. So it reminds me of a bookstore, Scheltema, in Amsterdam. It's a fancy bookstore, very Instagrammable. Everyone came to take pictures for the Instagram rather than buy books. But what I saw there was the front exhibition, the pameran buku yang paling depan, display buku yang paling depan. The front display was in response to the Black Lives Matter, the Scheltema exhibited books about racism, as well as post-colonial literature. What surprised me was not even a title came from Indonesian context. So not Max Havelaar, not the Alfred Bernays, not the, you can tell. It's very intriguing. Whenever we spoke about colonialities and post-colonialities, the Dutch would speak about Indonesia, the Dutch is in this. But at that very day, Scheltema decided not to. Welcome, Ibu Susan, to this morning session. Decided not to exhibit. I don't know why. It's only Anton the Pop was there. For his Latin answer. Okay, without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce today's speaker or lecturer. So Dr. Jacqueline Bell is a professor of modern Netherlands literature. She is also in the Multatuli chair at the Vrije Universiteit van Amsterdam. She has published numerous publications on her expertise on the Netherlands literature, but she specializes in the literature concerning the fin de siècle and the first half of the 20th century, the Second World War, and the at the moment, I'm not sure whether it's updated, so it's in the full website. I hope it's updated because here it says that at the moment you are working on the research concerning the novels, the Jewish novel in the first half of the 20th century, and her latest publication was back in 2021. The Post-Colonial Spiegel, the Netherlands later and her Lezen, the book that she wrote together with Rick Hollings and Koen van het Veer. And Jacqueline Bell is also a chairwoman for the JE, the High Genootschap, and vice chairwoman for the Stichting Willem Frederik Herman Institute. And only last month you were the jury member of the BNG Literature Prize, which I believe one of the most reputable literature prize in the Netherlands. She's also redactor of numbers of titles, and I cannot mention one by one and a lot. So I believe I should give the floor to Jacqueline. We have, of course, 2 hours of events, but of course, maybe approximately 45 to 50 minutes lectures, and the rest we can do the Q&A with the audience here as well as in the Zoom. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, also in the Zoom, I don't know where to look. First of all, I would like to thank the staff of the Department of History of the University of Granada for inviting me to present the lecture today. I feel really honored that I may do that. So thank you very much, and thank you for your attention. The words "A Girdle of Emerald" in the title of my lecture is a citation from the novel Max Havelaar, I'm sure you know it, published in 1860 by the famous Dutch writer Multatuli. Emerald is a precious green stone, as you might know, and the quote refers to the beautiful tropical nature of the Indonesian archipelago, which Multatuli also called Insulinde. The name of Indonesia at that time was Dutch East Indies, but Multatuli thought the word Dutch not appropriate because in his view the Netherlands did not possess the East Indies. Sukarno, your first president, liked the novel Max Havelaar, and he also used these words, "A Girdle of Emerald." So I thought it appropriate to give my lecture this title and start to tell something about this quote. Later, the phrase "Girdle of Emerald" was interpreted a bit differently, as we shall see. But today I will talk about the literary works about this girdle of emerald that Dutch authors wrote during and after the colonial period, when Indonesia was called the Dutch East Indies. These novels nowadays are still labeled as Dutch East Indian novels, also because that sounds a bit strange. Certainly now I'm standing here in Yogyakarta and I'm sitting here. I wanted to make these preliminary remarks. In the Netherlands today, Indonesia is in the focus of the attention, especially the troubled historical relationship between the Netherlands and Indonesia is subject to discussion and scrutiny. No more fuzzy feelings about the so-called Tempo Dulu, but a large research project on the role of the Dutch military during the so-called Indonesian War, I mean the decolonization war, was published some months ago. The conclusion was that the Dutch armed forces committed structurally atrocious violence in this war including many war crimes. After publication of the report, Dutch Prime Minister Rutte made sincere apologies on behalf of the Dutch cabinet and admitted that the former Dutch official position was false. In 1969, I forget. The Dutch cabinet concluded after swift examination of the crimes committed by such Dutch soldiers that these were excessive, but that the main body of the armed forces had operated within legal boundaries. These excuses were heavily criticized. And today, the political landscape the last months was split between groups who thought Rutte's excuses were too little, too late, what about 350 years of colonial repression, and others who were of the opinion that Rutte should not have apologized at all. I will not go into details now, and this historical research project is not the only sign that Indonesia is present in the focus of the attention of the Dutch audience. Important is, for instance, the exposition Revolutie in the next museum. It caused a lot of discussion about the Indonesian Revolution, very interesting. In theaters, you could listen to monologues about the past in the Indies, but also picture books on the former colony were published. And among the host of initiatives was also, for instance, a glossy word, glossy with the word pinda, which means katjang. On the cover, issued by and for so-called Indos or Indo-Europeans, people of a mixed background. In this case, we are talking about writers like Marion Bloem, Gustav Peek, Guido Michielsen, and Alfred Birny. The name Pinda or Katjang was criticized by many people because in the past that word was used to insult people with mixed roots. But this time it was meant as a label to be proud of. The glossy was successful, it had to be reprinted immediately, although recently the name has been changed into Inda, which means beautiful, as I'm told. Moreover, a poetry volume was published by Ellen Dekwits, Higher Science, in which she describes how fear, in this case connected to the trauma of the Japanese concentration camps in Indonesia during World War II for Europeans and Indo-Europeans. She describes how that fear is inherited by the next generation. Children of parents who were incorporated in such camps can also suffer from this past, is her message. The last year, also some modern day Dutch Indian novels were published, written by Bloem, By, and Birny, authors who focus on their Dutch East Indian background. On the PowerPoint, you can see on the right Marion Bloem, who published the first in 1982, first published the second generation novel, Not an Ordinary Dutch Indian Girl. We have also Leslie Bai, another writer who asked attention for the so-called Nyai, the Indonesian women who lived together with Dutch men in the colonial time as a housekeeper, but also as a concubine. Bai, who is a descendant of the Nyai, calls these women primeval mothers of the Dutch East Indies. Guido Michielsen published also a novel on the Nyai, Lighter Than I, which was recently translated in Indonesian. Her book was published last week, if I'm not mistaken, and Guido visited Jogja on a book tour, so maybe there are amongst you people who have met her, I don't know. This is a novel in which the so-called Nyai tells her story, so she writes back, it's very interesting. Especially Birny's bestseller, The Inquisitor of Java, you see him on the left, a stunning and violent bestseller published in 2060, got lots of attention and 2 literary awards. It's an autobiographical novel partly inspired on the Dutch East Indian past of his father, in which not only the colonial time but also the decolonization and the post-colonial time is described from a Dutch East Indian perspective, with a passion and rhetoric power that seemed to deeply touch the feelings of his Dutch audience. Some people even compared the novel with Max Havelaar, the famous novel written by Multatuli. I will talk about this novel later. Max Havelaar is, in short, a story, well, perhaps you know this, but I want to recall it, a story about a Dutch civil servant in the Dutch East Indies with a very critical message. The Japanese people were being abused, mistreated, and exploited in the name of the Dutch government. Al-Tawfiq himself was also a civil servant in Indonesia in the middle of the 19th century, who fought against colonial injustice in the Regency. Each Dutch novelist, Max Havelaar and the interpreter of Java will be my subject today. I will sketch a short history of these Dutch East Indian novels and will pay more attention to Multatuli and Gurney, Multatuli, the godfather of the Dutch East Indian literature, but also a well-known writer in Indonesia, as I've been told, and Gurney, who introduced a new vision on colonial past in the interpreter of Java. One of my questions will be, why was the interpreter of Java such an enormous success, and in what way the reception of this novel can tell something about changing visions in the representation of the decolonization in the Netherlands? To do so, I follow the way back and I will start my inquiry with, in my opinion, the very beginning of colonial literature, Max Havelaar, go on with the historical sketch on Dutch East Indian literature, and end with Gurney. But first, some short preliminary remarks. Visions on the colonial period have changed the last decades. After publication of Orientalism, written by Edward Said in 1978, a new critical vision on colonial past was presented, the so-called Post-Colonial studies. In a nutshell, Said's idea is that Western people created in their writings, literature, and research a special, mostly inferior image of the Orient to install and reinforce their own power in that way. They created, for instance, in their novels the image of the so-called other, and this other was represented as less important, inferior, sometimes even less human. The other was also voiceless. After Said, many other theorists developed post-colonial theories, for instance, Baba, Spivak, and Ashcroft. The last one introduced the idea of writing back. Formerly, colonized people wrote back to the colonizer, rewriting history and criticizing the past in that way. So with the word post-colonial, not only the period after decolonization is meant, but also, and perhaps this meaning is more important, a critical approach. So I do hope I can also present a critical approach on the colonial past today. In my opinion, literature can be a very interesting source for historians because it shows how the colonial society was represented and what were the opinions on the colonial system in the past. Let's have first a look at Max Havelaar written by Multatuli. And although I don't want to start a debate about the question of the beginning of the Dutch East Indian literature, as many of you know, before 1860s, many travel stories about Indonesia were written, I can defend my decision to start with Multatuli's novel, for instance, because it was the first time that so many people reacted on a literary text about the colony, as in the case of Max Havelaar. Perhaps you already know Multatuli's novel, which was and still is very famous in the Netherlands. There are more than 40 translations. This was my schedule for Orientalism. Yes, the translation. In the left you see the Indonesian and the English translation. If I am well informed, it has some fame in Indonesia. Perhaps you can share the next. Multatuli and his ideas on, for instance, equality were well known by Indonesian intellectuals who were leading the movement for the national liberation. Multatuli's great nephew, Ernst Douwsdekker, known as Setia Budi, was a member of this movement and is one of your national heroes. As I mentioned earlier, Sukarno had read Max Havelaar, but also your internationally famous writer, Anantha Tour, was an admirer. He called Max Havelaar the book that killed colonialism. And perhaps you have already visited the beautiful Multitude Museum in Rakelswijk-Toen, in the back, the place where the story of Max Havelaar is situated. If not, please do so. It's a marvelous place to be. Okay, let me now turn to Max Havelaar. The novel started with the sentence, I am a coffee broker and I live at Lauriergraaf number 37. The construction of the novel is imaginative and complex. The main story is about the colonial civil servant Max Havelaar, who finds again mistreatment of the farmers in his district. The main story is embedded in other stories. I cannot go into all details, but will give a short impression. The novel is composed of three main parts with the three main protagonists. Rijstobel, the coffee broker, a conservative and hypocritical man. He's in short a businessman who profits from the colonial benefits. The second protagonist is Max Havelaar, colonial administrator who defends the rights of the Indonesian people against the local regions, and behind their backs, of course, the Dutch colonial rulers who force the Indonesians to pay taxes. Instead of producing rice, they have to concentrate on coffee. This storyline focuses on the conflict between Max Havelaar and the regent Ghana. The third protagonist is Multitude, the author himself, who picks up the pen at the end of the book and formulates his sharp critique on colonial exploitation of Indonesia. His message, Japanese people are being mistreated and exploited in the name of the Dutch king, and the Netherlands are a real pirate state. Apart from these three basic parts of the novel, there are also short stories and poems included in it. For instance, the well-known, very moving tragedy of Sensuality, the Japanese youngsters who are confronted with the injustices committed by the regent, who confiscates their buffaloes time and again, and the injustice of the Dutch colonial system that is responsible for these misconducts and exploitation of the Indonesian people. And of course, for the brutal way that soldiers put a bloody end to any call for justice by the suppressed people. The book starts with some more or less humorous satirical chapters in which Dutch conservative Protestant coffee broker with the spoken name Rijstobel is the narrator. He presents himself as the publisher of the book on coffee, and he paints a decent religious portrait of himself as someone who goes to church every week, hates poetry, plays in literature, all lies according to him. He's a truth-loving businessman, more or less in an absurd manner. Anyway, the reader knows very soon Rijstobel is a hypocrite and a colonial profiteer. It is clear this protagonist Rijstobel is being used in irony and has not to be taken seriously in the book. The novel, according to Rijstobel, is based upon a bundle of manuscripts he received from an impoverished former schoolmate who failed in his colonial career. Rijstobel calls him Showman because he has no money to buy an overcoat, which is really necessary in the cold Dutch winter. But this man who can only afford a shawl is Max Havelaar. He turned after his career in Indonesia is impoverished and hopes to earn some money with the publication of his writings. Rijstobel thinks that the book might be of interest because there are some titles about coffee, and there's also one title in the I hope you don't need this wake-up call. Too many details about mental people. Okay, and Rijstobel wants to read, he's afraid for a rebellion of the Japanese people, and this rebellion could be a threat to the coffee market. Because Rijstobel cannot write the book himself, he asked a trainee to do it, and this German trainee writes a very different story. He writes the story of Max Havelaar, so there's hardly anything about coffee in the novel, but it's the critical story about Max Havelaar, who fights for justice. The third part is very short, only 3 pages, but very impressive. Here the writer Multatuli takes up his pen. He kicks out all protagonists, especially the despicable Drijskabel, and formulates his anger about the injustices and the administrative misbehavior of the Dutch. Multatuli replies to the enormous profits the Dutch derive from their colony at the cost of the gross exploitation of the Japanese people, Indonesian people. The book ends with the famous quote in which Multatuli addresses the King of the Netherlands, and I quote, I ask with confidence, is it your imperial will that more than 30 million subjects out there be mistreated and exploited in your name? Famous masterwords. Well, when you read Max Havelaar, you can see it's a very critical book on the colonial context. The other way. After 1870, so we made a jump in time, a lot changed in the colony. The so-called cultuurstelsel was replaced by a liberal market system. Every individual could enter the country and start his plantation. Indonesia was not that far away anymore because the Suez Canal had opened a new route from the Netherlands to Indonesia. Instead of a dangerous voyage of 6 months via the Cape in South Africa, it was possible to travel the colony in 6 weeks. For us, still a long time, but at the time it was really a big change. Novels about the Indies became more and more popular. As you know, of course, at the time there was no radio, no television, movies, or mobile phones. Google Earth did not exist. So novels were an important source of information for daily life in the colony. These novels functioned as a kind of route guides or Lonely Planet. Reading these novels, you could get an impression of life at the other side of the world. So many novels were published that critics in the newspapers started to become tired of them. One of them wrote, for instance, "Oh no, not again another Dutch East Indian novel." But you can imagine these novels influenced the image people in the Netherlands constructed of the colony. And interesting is that after Max Havelaar, many Dutch East Indian novels show some critical remarks on the system. The novel Max Havelaar is also even mentioned sometimes in these novels. Nevertheless, the focus is in most East Indian novels on a Dutch, mostly white protagonist living in colonial society. Indonesian people mostly are hardly mentioned. If they are present, they play a small role at the background, being a servant or a nyai. After reading many of these novels, you can make a kind of profile of these novels. Yes. First, as I told you before, in most East Indian novels depict only the life of Dutch colonial people. The Indonesian characters it mentioned are mostly only part of the silent background to add some exotic atmosphere. Mostly they don't speak. In this way, Multatuli was an exception with his story of Saint and Linda. Secondly, the protagonist, almost is always a white person who is not seldom a shady character. He only wants to earn lots of money. He even commits murder sometimes if he thinks it's necessary. He's corrupt, and mostly he has several sexual relationships outside marriage. All these things are described without any moral comment. This is a very great variation from the literature produced in the Netherlands, which is in the greater part of the 19th century the bearer of strict moral bonds. But reading this colonial literature, you can see that the idea is that when white people live in the tropical Indies, in the colony, their moral standards are corroded and their behavior is affected by it. And this at that time was also more or less accepted by the Dutch reader. Thirdly, there is a strong accent on sensuality and liberal sexual habits. Male protagonists lived and married together with local women. They drank and swear profusely, all of which was considered scandalous behavior in the Netherlands. Critics sometimes reject emphasis on sexuality and loose morality. One critic wrote in 1900, and I quote, "It's perhaps possible that in the tropics sexuality is stimulated because of the climate, but I cannot believe that people down there are so obsessed with the devil of sexuality as is described in this novel." End quote. Now we're talking of Dutch people. Fourth, although many novels have some critical remarks on colonial system, they nevertheless pick the line of Europeans without any structural points of criticism. Sometimes a faint echo of Max Havelaar can be heard. For example, Perelaar's novel La Daima, published in 1886, can be seen as a call to end the criminal opium trade in the Indies. That trade was run by the Dutch government, by the way. Most of these novels paint the exotic landscape, and often they pay attention to the mystical subcurrent in the local culture, so-called Guna or other aspects of the unseen world. The sixth and last characteristic is about the style of these novels. While in the Netherlands the literary style was rather complex or artificial at the end of the 19th century, these colonial novels were written in quite sober, direct language that made them also very popular by a large audience. The main picture of colonial life that rises above this colonial genre is that colonial society is white, there's hardly any attention for Indonesian people, and when there is, they are mostly treated in a negative way, and many times they are mistreated. So colonial literature confirms the Orientalist vision Said talks about. Multatuli was an exception, although there are also different interpretations of that novel. Let me now briefly focus on three of the writers in the period between 1870 and 1900, Dam, Couperus, and Augusta de Witt. Novels by Dam, critics refer to him as Paatje, P.A., Paatje Dam, are written according to a naturalistic profile, which means he tries to depict a correct, realistic image of society, the result of scientific research taking into account race, placement, and milieu, in French, which means heredity, the time in which the novel has been written, and circumstances. Of course, this did not result in an objective image of the Indies. It was his vision he presented. But his works are still interesting and very readable. In fact, he was a good writer, a journalist also. He depicts quite a critical view on the Dutch protagonists in his novels. Their only goal seems to become rich in a short time. Because of his high irony, his criticism seemed bearable to his audience. His protagonists often treat the Indonesian concubines merciless. When they get bored with these women, they are simply sent back to their kampong. The novel number 11 is dedicated to this theme and more general to concubinage, which makes it very interesting. Also, because the Njai in this novel plays an important part, she doesn't want to go back to her kampong, so instead she poisons the newly arrived fiancé of her employer with pill number 11. I don't know if it still exists nowadays. The Dam depicts with his colonial protagonist as mostly corrupted, hypocritical persons who don't mind killing if they think it's necessary. They really drink a lot. I quote, "And so it was time and again, every night, the old drinking parties. Sometimes they started already in the early morning. The whole garden was littered with empty bottles of champagne." End of quote. This description resembles the way Dutch author Lodewijk van Dijssel, who never visited in the colony, described his Dutch compatriots in Indonesia. I quote, "Dutch people in the Netherlands are very decent and of high morality, but when they arrive in the colony, they just behave as if they are traveling. And even if they stay there for their whole lives, they feel so free that they start becoming lazy like pashas and start feasting like idiots." And let us move back to Dam. Mostly his protagonists are white, but in the novel Abu Bakr, he chooses another perspective. The protagonist is an Indo-European who is not recognized by his white father, with the result that he must become a pariah, living on the edge of society. It's depicted in a very negative way. But Abu Bakr's mother gave her opinion about how her people is being treated. I quote, "They are poor and suppressed people. They always have to work for other people and everybody speaks negatively about them. They are always treated like dogs and nobody asks who gave them the right to treat them that way. If they are not obedient, everybody shouts, 'It's a shame, they are so unpolite.'" Very different is a beautiful novel by Louis Couperus, The Hidden Force, published in 1900, who has all the mentioned characteristics of the Dutch East Indian novel. Couperus, like Maltese, one of the best Dutch novelists, though he's less critical about colonial society in his literary works. Many of these Dutch East Indian books are not so literary, but The Hidden Force is really an exception. And it can be interpreted also as an answer to Max Havelaar. Couperus also focuses on a conflict between a Dutch colonial ruler and a region, as is the main story in Max Havelaar. Well, Montefiore paints quite a cold, critical portrait of Regent Katanagara. Couperus depicts the region as a decadent hero who, despite his drunkenness, looks much nobler than the Dutch protagonist. Couperus goes a step beyond Montefiore, not only in his aesthetic style, but also with his message, even if it's hidden in the story. The idea is Dutch people simply do not belong in Indonesia. The climate, the people, and the very soil of the colony is hostile. So in the end of the novel, the end of the colony is predicted in the novel. In my opinion, very interesting, as it presents, in fact, also a very critical perspective on the whole colonial enterprise. Around the year 1900, a new colonial mentality was introduced. The colonized people should no longer be subjected to exploitation, but be given an education. This was called the ethical politics. We would call them, in the hindsight, quite paternalistic. After de Wit, who supported these ideas, she had an open mind for the Indonesian people and she was against the colonial system. But in fact, in her short novel Orpheus in the Dessa, published in 1903, she was much more connected to the Temple Doodle vision that paints a distorted picture of colonial realities. Yes, it's about a Dutch businessman who sees an Indonesian musician, a poor boy, who plays the flute in a marvelous way, music that creates a magical Indonesian atmosphere. The businessman starts dreaming and comes in another world when he listens to his music, but this is only temporary. When he starts working again, he forgets the poor young boy. Also typical for the race relations in the colonial era is the fact that the Wit calls the administrator of mixed background unreliable, a common prejudice at the time. In the 20s, the colony became more modernized, and in the 30s, another kind of novels were published. Rubber, for example, by Manuel Stephen Gudos, and The Country of Origin by Edith Bellon. These are also novels in a lighter, a Western and white perspective. They fit in the model of the Dutch East Indian novel, and again, they contain criticism towards the colonial system or colonial society. The bestseller Rubber also caused a scandal, not only because the novel addresses the tens of thousands of so-called coolies, contract laborers were being exploited and treated like slaves in Sumatra, but also because the life of the plantation director was very decadent. Profits in rubber business were high and all the richness led to decadent behavior. In Coolie, another novel by Jacqueline Bell, she pictures the hard life of her Indonesian protagonist, a rare trait in this genre. The author shows on the one hand how all these workers are exploited and mistreated, but calls them at the same time stupid and simple. De Baron, in his country of origin, shows another image. This novel has a special structure, just like Max Havelaar. In fact, the novel tells two stories. The story of a boy who grows up in the Dutch East Indies, and the story in which the protagonist is grown up and lives in Europe. These two storylines alternate in the novel. Also, various genres are used, for instance, also diaries and letters. In the novel, the protagonist looks back on his East Indian youth that resembles a paradise. In this novel, even before the end of the colonial era, we see that the Indies are represented and idealized as a beautiful country, a kind of paradise. It symbolizes the longing for a lost world. But there also must be said that Duperon had a realistic view on the Indonesian people and had close relations with Indonesian intellectuals these days. Now we move on. I hope you can understand all these names to the period after the Second World War, with very different writers like Charlie Robinson, Hella Haase, and Maria Bermond. Charlie Robinson was the first Dutch East Indian writer who was not a member of the Dutch white Toto elite, who became very famous at first in the Indo-European community in the Netherlands, but after the publication of his collected works in a broader audience. After the Indonesian independence, especially after 1950, many Indo-European people immigrated to the Netherlands or other places in the world because the country they had lived in, the Dutch East Indies, did not longer exist. In works as Duke, Charlie Robinson shows the world from a new perspective, an Indo-European who is exposed to two worlds, the Dutch and the Indonesian. This theme is important in many Dutch East Indian novels. After the Indonesian independence, many Indo-European felt like displaced citizens of two cultures. Maria Derma depicts in The Tens of Thousand Things the mysterious world of the East. She sees a big difference between East and West, but in her beautiful novels, this is not connected to the color of the skin or the cultural background someone has, but only to the place where one lives or feels at home. During the Indonesian War or Revolution, Hella Haase published her debut novel Uru. Her two protagonists are a Dutch boy versus an Indonesian boy who grew up together as best friends in the former colony. But when they meet, aging during the war, they are enemies. Haase describes the ending of the colonial life as if she had been excluded from the tropical paradise, the country where she was born. She also is longing for a Dulu. We take another giant step. You can follow me. In the 80s, the second generation of Dutch East Indian authors started writing novels about the colonial past and colonial heritage. Their parents were born in the Dutch East Indies, but they do not share that memory. They only have the stories filled with grief and nostalgia of their parents. Names are Abraham Bloem, Deel Stolp, Adriaan van Dis, and Hans Jans. Their novels were received very positively by the Dutch critics and the Dutch public. These novels of the second generation follow also a kind of schedule. I'm familiar with all that I have to stop. I hope you can stand my pictures a little more. I'm familiar with an interesting article in which he formulates these characteristics. The protagonist is a Dutch East Indian person, man or woman, who looks back at his or her difficult youth. They had problems with their identity. In fact, they grew up between two cultures, the Dutch East Indian and the Dutch culture. Secondly, the cultural East Indian background plays an important role. Indonesian food, Indonesia, represented by the paintings of the Sabah landscape with volcano on the wall, Montyon music, language, a lot of water in the toilet, and of course, the Indonesian Far East Indian mysticism, Guna Guna, etc. Third point is the strong authoritative father and mother who are the bridge between past and present. They are the connection between their lives in the Netherlands and the former colony. The parents suffer because they miss their lost home country. Often they are traumatized by the Japanese occupation during World War II, or by the so-called Bersiap episode, which is contested very much the last time. The silent father, often a veteran, occurs in many of these novels. Parents have also sometimes an ambivalent attitude against their Dutch East Indian background. Also, the physical appearance, for instance, skin color, plays a role. Being a young girl, Marion Bloom's protagonist discovered that Dutch people use the color of the skin to discriminate. Bernie also is one of the second generation authors, but he has another voice. He wrote The Interpreter of Java, and he rejects the concept of the silent father attached to the idea of the second generation authors. In his opinion, it's a cliche that fits within the Orientalist idea of the silent but wise Easterling. Apparently, Bernie's father could not stop talking about the cruel past. The fact that he was an exception doesn't annul the fact that many of the fathers in other novels are silent because of their traumatic past. Bernie's father also wrote down his bloody experiences working as an interpreter during the Indonesian Revolution. And here we have a big difference with the East Indian literature I dealt with before. What is the story of the Interpreter of Java? Some critics call it an autobiographical sledgehammer. The protagonist's name is Alan Noland, trying to speak in No Land. He feels homeless. He looks back on his traumatized youth in child care homes. He and his brothers and sisters were put there because of the violent behavior of the father. He was traumatized by his past in the Dutch East Indies, the father. First, the father was not accepted as a son by his natural Dutch East Indian father, and later, during the decolonization war, he fought as an Indo-European, first against the Japanese occupiers and later against the Indonesian people. Being an interpreter of the Dutch army, he used a lot of violence, torture, and killed many people. His arrival in the Netherlands was a big deception. East Indian people who came in the Netherlands in the 50s were not received warmly. On the contrary, even if they had fought in the army, they received only a cold shoulder. The novel The Interpreter of Java has a complex structure, just like Max Havelaar, and it has three storylines. In the first storyline, the protagonist Ellen Nolan looks back at his youth, which is tainted by the paranoid behavior of his father and his stay in boarding schools. He is also discussing with his twin brother about the reality of the war diary of their father. Was their father really such a brutal killer? Second storyline is his father's manuscript, in which he writes about the school years in the Dutch East Indies, where he experienced racism, his participation in the decolonization war, and the disappointing arrival in the Netherlands. The third storyline is a conversation between Alan and his mother, the white daughter of a carpenter in the southern part of the Netherlands. These three storylines are divided in 5 parts that are also split up into several subdivisions. Some parts are called spekboek, referring to a specific kind of Dutch East Indian cake. Perhaps it's also Indonesian. I like it very much. Yeah, it's also an Indonesian cake I wrote here. This detail, of course, adds to the East Indian, or if you want, Indonesian atmosphere in the novel. The reference, as does the reference to mysticism and guna. There's, for example, a Dutch East Indian grandmother who had passed away already a long time ago, but she still talks to her son, Father Nolan, when he is dying. The novel is written in various styles. The style of the manuscript of Nolan's father is quite old-fashioned and formal. Nolan's discussions by meal with his relatives have a colloquial character. The Queen's call each other bro. The parts narrated by Alan Nolan vary between sarcastic to angry or witty. The book can be read in various ways. It's an autobiographical novel, a historical novel, a Bildungsroman, coming of age, a Vatershoeven, search for the father figure, or a post-colonial novel, not only because the book partly deals with the post-colonial era, but especially because it's very critical about the colonial past, decolonization war, and it depicts the heavy results of wrong habits from the colonial period. In my opinion, the very positive reactions and on the prize-winning novel Burning reflects a change in the Dutch public opinion towards a more critical attitude about the colonial period, especially the decolonization of the Dutch East Indies. Dutch sociologist Abraham de Zwaan wrote a catching essay some years ago about the problems the Dutch are having to face their own violent colonial past. Time and again, the Dutch are confronted with the crimes committed by the military in Indonesia, and every time this seems to come like a big surprise. The Swan refers to this as post-colonial absences. I like it very much. It seems the Netherlands sometimes have difficulties coping with their history, but Bernie's novel paints a sharp image of this new vision of the past. The big impact of the interpreter of Java led to the comparison of the novel to Multatudis Max Havelaar. And while it of course remains an open question whether a book like Max Havelaar can ever find its equal, there are certain parallels. Both novels criticize in their own manner the colonial system in the Dutch East Indies. Bernie's novel is in this aspect perhaps ahead of Max Havelaar. Multatuli was very sharp in his critique, but Bernie confronts the colonial system as such, and that's something Multatuli in his age did not yet do already. Although I have to say, Multatuli also considered the Netherlands to be a pirate state. Moreover, Bernie presents a new East Indian Dutch perspective by giving a voice to some who lived during the segregated colonial system of the Dutch East Indies, and also by giving his vision on the most recent process of decolonization. Both novels share the fact that they are revealing. Multatuli paints wrongdoings of the Dutch administration in the colony, while Bernie focuses on racism inside the armed force and Dutch society, pointing at East Indian military personnel that had to cope with the cold and negative reception in the Netherlands after decolonization, and with the trauma that was the result of that reception also for the next generation. What then can be the conclusion now? We have taken big steps through the history of Dutch colonial and post-colonial literature. What can we see looking back? The East Indian literature started with Max Havelaar, a very critical novel on the colonial system by Multatuli, who in the story of Saidja and Adinda puts the Indonesian people at the heart of his book. But East Indian novels afterwards show repeating patterns in which only the white colonial elite is being put into the spotlights. On the background, you can see a silent Indonesian population that is sometimes depicted in degrading terms. But nevertheless, these novels also contain marginal criticism towards the colonial system, some more than others. Over time, the novel shows a shift in imagery, like the slow but steady influx of Indonesian characters, although in the beginning they were being stereotyped in a negative way. The nostalgic Tempo Dulu image also changed in time. Around the year 1900 it started with ethical idealization by Auguste de Witt, but in the middle of the 1930s we got almost negative about the colonial enterprise and its novel country of origin. At the same time, however, the protagonist feels homesick for his motherland, Indonesia, while staying in the Netherlands. The feeling of Tempo Dulu is strong in the post-colonial era after World War II, when people are longing for the past, the colonial times they lived in, the beautiful country of the East Indies that they lost forever, as they put it. Second generation author Alfred puts an end to a lot of those cliches by writing colonial history from the East Indian perspective of two generations in an interpreter genre. In doing so, he depicts the colonial system while also criticizing the for the corrupted vision of decolonization. Gurney rejected the terminology that the Dutch always used to cover up the violent decolonization war in Indonesia. There were no police actions. The Dutch army used structural extreme violence, according to Gurney. And with that, he concurs with the latest results of post-colonial history, as written by Leon Limbach in his dissertation, The Burning Kampons of Generaal Spoor. And so, the enthusiastic reaction of the Dutch readers when this book appeared reflects also a new, more critical attitude towards the colonial cause. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacqueline, for a glimpse of the Dutch literature concerning the former leadership cities, or what we call Indonesia in the colonial period. I believe it's time for discussions and Q&A. Anyone who wants to give input, so maybe those who are in Zoom, you can type, and then by invisible power, I will know what you write. Ada yang ingin bertanya, you can ask in any bahasa itu, Pak Bambang, itu atau mungkin Pak Bambang. Perlu nih Pak, ini yang microphone. Okay.
Thank you. Jacqueline, it was very interesting to have since this very interesting book. Thank you very much. I think I agree with you to some extent. The one part of the Maksala on the Saita and Hindu, which could be translated in my word is me and my girl, or me and my wife, because it should be Saija, it should be Saya. That's the way the people call themselves in the past. So it could be Saya and Adinda. Adinda could be wife of my girl. This part, I think, make a very distinctive part. We compare with others novels produced by the Dutch East Indies people up to it. But what interesting to me for Indonesian reader, I'm not talking about the Dutch reader, I'm discussing this part. This part is very interesting for me because it also criticizes, the local leaders. That's a very important. So you can see the colonial system. You can see a very, very holistic colonial system. We are not talking only about the colonial in terms of Western or the Dutch people, but also we're talking about the Indonesian, the native, the local, how the local behave. That's a very important, and a full of what you call it a social history in that. I think that's a very distinctive part when compared to others novels. And the way that how Maksabra presented it's really like it's really what I understand from my Indonesian perspective. That's really the way that how we should construct our historiography. That's the way that what I understand. So when this Pasteur, came to this point, when he said that, why the colonial never trust the native to be higher part of the colonial bureaucracy. I think because the colonial system inspired by this part of the Saija and Adinda. That's I think that's a very, very, very good. But my point now is not on that, because in that sense, I want to know more from you about what you call it, the life of the female in most of this kind of novel. That's all right. I'm not talking about the gender perspective or whatever, something like that. But I really would like to hear more, because when we read the part of Adinda, this is a very interesting for me how the local the Bantanese or the Kastranka or the Labaks ladies, really like at the time. So that's why I really want to know from you how far that this novel, the later novel, and then describe or maybe talking about the life of the female, in the novel. That's all I would like to hear.
Perhaps you said a lot, and I have not, because of the time and the choice of my broad subject, I could not go into details about Max Havelaar, because I agree that it's the criticism is based on the real system imposed by the Dutch in the beginning of your question. So I agree, but I'm not sure that I understand your question. But
yeah, because I missed from your talk, because when I read the part of Saija Adinda, it's a very, very interesting part of the life of the woman, life of the female side of the local. So that's why I would like to know about this, because I haven't read most of the novel that you mentioned yet. Okay. Because besides in what Bernie, I think a novel you mentioned about beside the insert for father, but I think I'm thinking about insert for mother, something like that. That's why really in my head is really I want to know more about women life, in the novel.
you want to know more about women? Well, perhaps Suzanne help me.
Yes, please.
Especially when you don't want to hear something about gender, but
yeah, well, maybe I can help you. One of the things I think that is emerging now in the picture, and maybe that is very important also in that respect, is that people start to think about the women. Because actually in those novels that I read them, they are always passive and they are always dependent on the man. They have to answer everything that the woman wants. And what the Indo-Dutch people in the Netherlands now really are trying to find out is who was our great grandmother? And what relationships did she live? And why is it that we don't know her name? And that it's an absolutely anonymous person, even taboo. It's not supposed to know who is your great grandmother, because the relationship was not accepted. And I think that in those novels, this is really a very important thing. And of course, it brings into a full picture the life of Indonesian women.
and in that way, the novel written by what's her name? The Nyai, the novel about Nyai, that is just translated, was published last week in Indonesian. It's the life of the Nyai, the diary of Nyai, because all these women are, what is it, without names, they are unknown, while they are the mothers of many people, especially from the Dutch East Indian altar, the Dutch East Indian population. But in Said and Adinda, the theme of the Nyai is not not present, I think they are, well, yes.
That's my point, because most of the people pay too much on the Nyai. That's my point.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, too much on the Nyai.
So too much attention to the Nyai, but not that really doesn't.
No, that's why I like it. That's part of the Saigon agenda.
Okay, because it's a normal relationship. I can understand it, that the focus, it makes it blurs your sight on history. I agree. That's why I think literature is so interesting, because you have to analyze it and to realize what are the images that are put into the heads of all these readers, and especially all these Dutch East Indian novels. They were read so heavily in the Netherlands that they filled in the ideas about how to think about the way life was in Indonesia at that time and how people behave. But it's not really true that there were no active women, because also Down, I meant Paatje Down, I mentioned him, his women are always emancipated. So the Indonesian woman, she poisons her. Okay, it's not really a positive way to be active, but well, she takes her fate in her own hands. She said, I don't want to accept that I'm sent away. I'll pay back with my yes, Suzanne?
Maybe the if I may, what the message was emphasizes in the ordinariness of the female stories, and maybe this ordinary female life, at least from your presentations, disappeared and it became centralized in one figure called Nani. So is there any examples where we can find the simple female, the very daily stories of female in the colonial or other novels after where did this
yes, there are many, but I had to draw really rough lines. I could talk about every book, we could talk a week. Max Havelaar half a year, because there are so many people. So I had to draw rough lines, but I think these lines are the things we have to deal with, because these are the images. But I really agree that ordinary people are much more interesting. But for instance, Couperus, who had also strong women in his novel, but in that case it was a Dutch woman with that behavior and that. But there's also Ulrich, who helps. Well, she's in Bantu, so it's not the higher society that you need in Dutch colonial literature, unfortunately. But these are what is it? Respectful portraits of normal people, and they are in. There's also one novel I didn't like it so much, but it was. I'm sorry about the Nyai again, but it's from her perspective that is written. She had to cry, and what was this? She was helping there, what happened? So I thought that's also interesting, but I'm sorry to speak for the Nyai again, because I can also tell more about normal.
But I think that the issue is that these are always women in a direct relationship to the colonial power.
Yeah.
In whatever position, as you said, and Linda, they suffer from the concept, but it's not about them. It's about their own life.
I was about to say that, so maybe we can say something about the degrees of participation in the colonial systems. Even though they were anonymous, maybe we should, Abi? It's only this one. You can speak louder.
I'll speak louder. Okay, so if anyone wants to continue with the discussion of Nyai, maybe we should continue the question first, because my discussion is different than that. Or okay, so anyway,
I can carry on.
Nobody dares to say something.
Because I thought it's a good discussion, so if someone still has a step. I just want to actually ask you, and this is from a very foreign perspective, I don't know much about it, but I want to ask about the post-colonial Indo-literature in the Netherlands. Because it seems it's productive, right, since the from the 50s upwards, and we don't really know much about it in Indonesia. It doesn't really, there's no discussion. Indonesia doesn't really, doesn't exist really. You don't really understand this context. And from what I understand about the Indo-Europeans in the Netherlands, they're very much integrated into Dutch society. They're sort of supportive of the colonial project in a way because they warn about the loss of it. Or maybe that's a bit too harsh. But in that, that's why I really want to ask why, or maybe I'm wrong, but why don't they engage in the nationalist, the Indonesian audience? It's very much it's inclusive within the Dutch and the diaspora.
Yes.
And also, is it changing? So are you seeing this that they are changing the early?
Yes, well, perhaps I asked if Bernie's novel was translated in Indonesian, and he said no, something went wrong. So sometimes I will try to figure out what happened, but you see this video on feels I don't mention the word "nyaya" anymore, but I think it's very interesting also for me to talk about the different perspectives on this literature and also Indonesian voices that have other ideas about these literature and problems. But I think in the Netherlands, the idea of that Indos are integrated in Dutch society, I think in one way it's correct, on the other way, and that's why the second generation Dutch East Indian novelists are interesting because they show the difficult world in which they grew up, because their parents are frustrated because they were not accepted in the right way, in their opinion, that most of them work in the colonial army, and they were received in a very bad way in the Netherlands, so they are angry again, and so they have their frustrations, and the society was quite racist, I think, at that time, and that it changed a lot in the last decades. So I think they had to fight many struggles, perhaps in the Netherlands, but I think the world is opening up, and I thought it very interesting that you started with Black Lives Matter, because I think you have, in many fronts, you have awakening that new perspectives finally on the whole colonial background and history is emerging, but in fact you see these discussions are being separated. Mostly I refer to the Black Lives Matter. I didn't do it now, but but this is also a kind of his historical background. The Bernie was before, but he was quite late. And the whole also Said was in '78, and people who study Dutch East Indian literature in the Netherlands were very oriented towards Tempo Dulu. That's why I published with a book with some colleagues a book Post-Colonial Mirror, which is more or less an answer to the historical overview of Bob Nieuwenhuis, who was really nostalgic about post paradise, etc. And try to look with a critical view to this literature and to the colonial past. So I don't know if it's an answer, but I hope that there will be more connections between, if I can say, the two of us. So perhaps I was in Jakarta some days ago, and I tried to find writers that have, Indonesian writers that have published on the colonial period, because I thought perhaps it would be interesting to have meetings, to study also these text novels together with Indonesian novels, to put where we can find each other, where there are differences, or I have to study more about that, but there were some people interested, so
I believe there is Iksakaban, one who wrote the individual title is Semua Untuk India. He quite a tour to The Hague, presenting, of course, in front of these Indo audience in the Sofia
Hall.
Sofia Hall. That's maybe a beginning.
Yes, yes.
Wait.
Well, thanks to Jacqueline for your lecture. It's really amazing and showing the changing of the society as well as from the novels. I have two questions. The first one is about Max Havelaar that you mentioned on the slide. Pramuda Yanto mentioned with writers saying that the country is killing the colonialism. Well, from the perspective of current day, that's sometimes might be right, but it's not really fully right.
Of course not.
It didn't kill much as how did it kill colonialism? It changed it. So in that respect, it's from if to what extent actually this Max Havelaar criticism, critical tone in Max Havelaar novel, but also found in the latter novel here during the colonial period. Because the colonialism is not gone, but it's changed. It's completely become like more sophisticated, you know. And do you find also dissertations, the one from Max Havelaar really asking questions like the Queen? Could we also find similar tone or similar expression in other novels? I mean, I can imagine that could be like the continuations of cartoons in novels. That's not a better after Max Havelaar.
Yes, I think it surely is. I should make a stronger focus of my, because I studied these books many years ago. I was astonished by the many books that appeared from like very unknown titles, etc. And then I said, oh, again, Multitude again, and now the last years I'm really focused on Multitude. So it started a new vision, but it's sometimes a bit cheap, perhaps. Okay, well, you profit here, they have got so bad, and but nevertheless, everybody is working in the system. But I think, and also what I thought about Kubelis, who implicitly does not mention the name of Tutuli, but the text was so well known at that time, and everybody was talking about it. So you see that the textuality is interesting, that message came through in many other texts. Also, Body Mind, it's a very bad novel, but very interesting in my opinion, because it's against the whole.
It's not so popular in Indonesia.
Sorry?
The Balu Daliman novel is not so popular compared to Max Havelaar.
No, but it's badly written, etc. But when I saw it, I thought, well, how interesting, more from a historical perspective and then from a literary perspective. I know it's not popular at all, but but I think that Montefiore is really an exception, because the fact that we are still talking about him after 160 years and publication. But yes, and about from Jan Ventura, I really wanted to involve some Indonesian perspectives on the novel, not to be too, because I felt a bit embarrassed to talk here about Dutch East Indian novel. Because it's so, they're mostly so colonial, and it's it's interesting that some aspects of some books were also adopted in a way,
I had my second point also I wanted to say that from some perspective that Pramudia is very important as well, especially this really talking about Nyai, for example. We have a colonial approach describing Nyai is very important, blah blah blah. But from some perspective, I think Pramudia also presented a very strong message about the actual, not really actual, real daily life of Nyai, for example, in this famous book, Human Mankind, well, this Nyai Sora is presented as a different kind of Nyai and has a very strong position and also influential. Even he can produce new generation of internationalists in the figure of also mentioned about the connection with the building structure, the new one generations of Dutch novelists. We have also Indonesian, Odi has mentioned Dr. Sakaban, but we have also Eka Kurniawan, who also describing very nicely about the I call it the Indus society, but from perspective of Indonesia and perspective of women, basically. In his book Luka, the one he really nicely described the difficult positions of mixed women who mostly described as beautiful, having attractive physical appearances, and he was living in changing period from the late colonial period until the nation's independence, during which he used his power, beauty, as a tool, as the way he manipulated realities in his life, for example, like that. So from this, I just want to brief the context of that. To what extent actually in this literature really important in the bigger picture of Dutch literature, because you're talking about Dutch colonial and post-colonial. My colleague will say, "Oh, Dutch never had a colonialism; it was colonized, not colonized. Colonizer is colonized." How about the bigger picture of Dutch literature, and then is it always the colonial past become a daunting realities and this up to present day, which can also understandable, especially when I'm calling involved in the research about things like that. The I call it the memory of persons actually very much about that society in the Netherlands, not in
Yes, and that was very interesting. Also, that when I heard on the last part of your talk, that it shows how much several countries can be locked up in their own perhaps small historical view. And also the attention for the Nyaya is also because in the Netherlands you have the Dutch East Indian second generation who writes a lot about the colonial past. So that's why the Nyaya, because they are all attached in fact to the Nyaya, because that's one of the role models. But it's not the whole picture of in that way, it's not representative for the whole colonial relationship. But in what way? Well, when you look at these Bill Ashcroft with his The Empire Bites Back, I always thought well, the Dutch East Indian perspective is in fact difficult because they were part of the colonial system in the Indonesia at the time of the but in the Netherlands they were in fact in the beginning a rejected group. So so I think for the history of the Netherlands it's important. Their point is important, and they are part of also emancipation, especially because Bernie he is very critical and has broader view also on the Dutch history is a lie. He writes in his book, and yes. So what is part of the bigger picture? Yes. Well, we have also other colonies, Suriname. These are perhaps other discussions about the same themes, but sometimes they are not come together exactly. There's also a book on plantation in Suriname, I think, and descendants of the plantation holder and his former slave or enslaved person. They talk about they discuss about their past, but it's not about Nyaya or whatever, but about the kind of position in the colonial structure in Suriname, I think. So but it's a broader perspective. I don't know exactly
No.
if what I say is relates to what you want to know, but
Yeah, maybe related to this, I was and Alicia and I wrote an analysis of what happened in the most important history journal in terms of writing about colonialism. And what we found was that actually immediately after decolonization, historians from Indonesia and from the Netherlands were working together and they spoke South language. But then actually all contact disappeared. So you've got a Dutch historiography of colonialism and you've got an Indonesian historiography. And actually after 2010, you can see that people start to publish together, that there is a much more interaction, and that things are changing again. And also language barriers are strong. And I would like to know your hypothesis, because literature is so dependent on intertextuality. People write and they have read other things and they write in relationship to music, for instance, as an example. Of course, many others. So this intertextuality is important. But somehow there seems to be no intertextuality between Indonesian fiction about the colonial past and Dutch fiction about the colonial past. And I don't understand why, but maybe it's the same as why they started in way at a certain lost contact.
And there was a difficult period also in the relationship between the Netherlands and the Sensuality.
Yeah, but that's very good material for a very good novel.
Yes, of course, of
You're
course.
not right about it.
Yes, but perhaps I'm trying to make an emphasization of who writes about the colonial past from an Indonesian perspective. And they have to be translated because our language knowledge is too
Would be a nice project.
because we could think about summer school now.
I know why, it's because of the album.
Okay.
Stop there.
No, so have to stop.
That's why.
That's what I mentioned it.
Oh, well, no spoilers.
Because I think.
Can I also just a little? I don't know if it's I feel like when in the Netherlands, the voices of Caribbean, they're so strong. Whether they perform demo, bring cards and stuff like that. But Indonesians, there's one Indonesians and there's one Ingles, but the voice is no voice almost. It doesn't. At least that's how I perceive it. It's also related, I guess, to why is there so minimal Indonesian voice in the Netherlands?
What about the Netherlands?
Except for the Moluccans, I guess. The Moluccans are the only Indonesian part in the Netherlands that has a voice in a way.
Yeah, well, I would like to join Bernie's voice also because he's really very explicit. Yeah,
but maybe my question would be, what is so different about Bernie? I understand from your presentation. So why is brain so important to you? Why is this person?
Well, he's the first well, in my opinion, I hope I don't miss other texts, but who addresses the real broader problem of the historical vision on the Dutch historical vision on history, and also the part of the Indo, but also of the second generation. So it's multi-focus, and it's a very angry book also. It's not. Well, some people think there is too much blood flooding in the book, but and well, I think it's also important because it was so. Bernie is already 60 and more, and he's writing for since the 80s. But he was never an important writer. Well, some people knew him, but he was a bit, what do you call it? Not a minor poet, but and with this novel, it won two very important literary prizes, and people were emotionally reacting on the book, and because it's like my Santa is also an angry book at the end. This is really a shame that what's happening here, etc. And perhaps that's also why Bernie is kind of new voice. And but you're right, because when you talked about the Black Lives Matter, so perhaps there's a kind of nobody needs it, but in practical sense, there are several groups that are not always working together, and also in the European group in the Netherlands, they are only quarreling with each other. So it's not really a strong. What is it? Strong. It's a strong community, but they always like to dispute each other's visions. But that's also fruitful, of course. But then you can't make one fist.
But isn't it also because Bernie's book, in the end, basically is about violence. The violence of the colonial past, and how that violence actually is part of deep patterns in Dutch society. And there's the relationship that matters.
Yes. But there's really, of course, there's a big relation between this book and Black Lives Matter, but the connection is not always made. That's what you were saying in the beginning. You never heard something about the Indonesian aspect. Then, of course, there's a story. It's all about the same problems, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Please.
Related to this mentioned. I think it's really interesting that for client and this other mentioned how people for the charity and for more outspoken. And I think the level of one community's outspokeness is it really depends on that community's position, so socially and politically, for your community. So I guess I'm just wondering what is the position of the Indo-Dutch or communications in that in the Netherlands, and how does that affect their society?
Well, interesting question, but I think it's very complicated because you have the oldest generation who were was part of the what was it, the army, the colonial army, and they are always fighting for they were not paid enough, and they had that reception in the Netherlands when they came. So they're considered to be, Suzanne can correct me if I'm wrong, but they were always kind of on the right wing, military, etc. And so you have younger ones who are dealing with other problems. So sometimes, just what I said about the reactions on the Rutte's apologies, that you have a group that is really why should he make apologies? We were also mistreated, etc. They're still in that phase, perhaps. So I think the group is really not, it's not able to put the whole community, if you can speak about a community at all, but I think there are several visions, not only depending on the age of the people, but also of their personal background, because the Persia, so I thought it was eye-opening. I thought, oh wow, how the Dutch are stuck into their own perspective. And, you know, and I can imagine that it can give you traumas, etc. If you have bad experiences, but but I think it was a very emotional reaction for many people that had connections with people that had to that suffered in that time. And so you see there are really many voices, but I think in the broader sense, the whole Dutch community, the society is opening up to better views. Although I quoted the Swan with this colonial absence, I think it's a fantastic article because time and again some discoveries are made and then on and oh, was it that it's a bit covered up? Not only in the Dutch East Indian Society book, the ideas are changing, but also in Dutch society. But you never can call everybody. I think everybody has the same opinion, but it moves a bit towards more post-colonial vision. It's my impression. That's not everybody will agree.
That's why there is a discussion.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. How a reaction from the government of Dutch when the writer Botadwe write the novel Max Author in this time? Do you have any reaction from the government of Dutch in this time?
Yes, yes. In the parliament, there were asked questions about it. And there was also a research started in the BAC to check if what the accusations of Max Authority about the system in the BAC, about the regent and corruption, etc. So there were reactions, but in fact, not many things changed. But I think it was the start of a broader engagement having another vision on the whole colonial enterprise. Because before Multitudio and also other people that were critical, but they wrote articles and then some people said, oh, interesting. Max Havelaar, that's the forced literature, when it's good literature, it can reach a broad audience. And, yeah. That's always, you have many people that were in favor of him and others were criticizing him. And well, Multitude was also a colorful person with not always one idea that was explored in a straight way, but they went there. And his political vision was, I think, state critical towards the colonial ideas, but he also loved women, for instance, so he made many enemies because every woman he saw that was a new love affair, and so he was together too. But another great writer, Dostoevsky also. But so he had always not enough money, and so that's also something that helps or not to build up a special relationship with the power, political power. He was always critical about everything.
I think that's interesting too. Maybe something from Nieuwenhuis will answer those questions. And I believe it's in Bahasa Indonesia. Yes. there's this book called Mitos dari Lebak. So it's in Bahasa, the meat. It's 10 minutes before we end, but maybe I will use my privilege as moderator. Only because I do well that you present a glimpse of you make several loops between periods, but I mean slightly mentioned about this emphasizing. Do we have titles that doesn't narrate about Java? That's not about Java, because I believe Dutch also have a very strong memory about Papua as their last frontiers, their last fortress, and they began to. They made in memoirs. They made a lot of commemorations about how they were the last. But we spoke about Java, about Labak, about others.
Well, yes, there's literature written by Springer about
Papua.
but it's not that much. But there's also Maria Derma, I mentioned here, the person who pays lots of attention to mysteriousness, but she doesn't connect only to Indonesian people, but to individuals. And so I think there's interesting another view on some stereotypical idea that Indonesian people are Western people are rational and all these things. So she's about she likes about one of that. So there are many. I could try to make a map to it is well to show that there are other voices, but some are heard in Java was, I think, also the administrative center of the power, because of course we're involved with earlier days.
Okay, because it's very interesting. Maybe this is for another session, because we talk about this voice, the contemporary voice of Moluccans, for instance, because it's very complicated. Where novels published in Jakarta would hardly accepted by Moluccans youth in the Netherlands, because they don't feel being a part of Indonesia. They feel that they are Moluccans, but they don't Indonesians. Yes, they want to learn their own. So it's not about maybe it's trespassing the nation states.
That's difficult. So you can. Well, so this when I'm talking about that is in colonialism, so in there is here, but yes, the Moroccan, there's a beautiful novel in Dutch by Roland, very beautiful against the Dutch system under the snow waves, something like that. Very beautiful, and it's also mixed up with the difficult situation of Moluccans in the Netherlands. So it's always that question, how far is it general? Is it general interesting? You also always with these local connections, and wonder how interesting it is for other countries. But on the other hand, mostly you can see structures behind it for countries and communities. I would really like to have more. Yes, more discussion also with writers and to read certain writers. I hope there are also translations. And move on.
Okay, I believe we should call it a day, and please give a round of applause to Dr. Jacqueline Bell. And before you leave the stage, I believe the Department of History has mementos. would you be kind to it's here and maybe would be can be presented by Dr. Wahid. So thank you, Jacqueline.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.